Conservatives have a common sense plan to cut taxes, build housing, fix the budget, and stop crime. And yet, this Prime Minister is not worth the cost. He doubled our national debt, doubled the cost of housing, and tripled it in Montreal, to be frank. The end of the month is approaching, and Quebecers have a lot of anxiety about paying their rent. Will the Prime Minister finally backtrack on his inflationary policies, which might make Quebecers lose their houses and apartments? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, instead of increasing and stoking Canadians' anxiety with misinformation, he should share the real facts. And the fact is that our fiscal position is stronger than other G7 countries. We have the highest credit rating of all countries in the world. We are working responsibly to ensure that the government's assets are used to the benefit of Canadians. We have a comprehensive plan to create housing for all generations. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition. Really? He's accusing me of stoking anxiety among Quebecers. Without me, they never would have noticed that their rent had doubled. If I hadn't mentioned it, does he think Quebecers can't read numbers? He says the economy is not numbers, but rent is certainly numbers. The grocery bill, that's numbers. Will he finally look at the numbers and conclude that he is simply not worth the cost? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, for months and even years, we've been hearing the Conservatives say that our policy of investing in Canadians is causing the challenges Canadians are dealing with. On the contrary, our fiscal position is the strongest among G7 countries. We are investing and using that strong position precisely to help families that are struggling to get by. We're investing in housing, in healthcare, in dental care, in senior care, in child care. All those investments help Canadians. And the government is at the service of Canadians. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Will axe the tax, build the homes, fix the budget, and stop the crime. This Prime Minister is not worth the cost after 9 years. He's doubled the debt, doubled housing costs. He's increased spending by nearly 80%. What did we get for the money? The worst per-person income growth in the entire G7. And the worst mortgage debt of all of those countries. When will he realize that the more he spends, the worse things get?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives have been talking down the economy for a long time now without understanding that Canada has actually the strongest macroeconomic performance in the G7. And our perspective is to put that solid footing of the Government of Canada in service of Canadians by investing in housing, by investing in dental care, by investing in childcare, by investing in the supports that Canadians need in this difficult time. His solution is for governments to invest less in Canadians for ideological reasons, to be there less for people when they need it most.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, more proof that this Prime Minister is not worth the cost. He tells Canadians they've never had it so good. He doubled the debt, doubled housing costs, forced 2 million people to a food bank. He brags that he spends $87 billion on housing programs, and what did it get us? Got us the worst housing inflation of any country in the G7, the second worst out of nearly 40 OECD countries. Why does he always spend the most to achieve the worst?
Right. The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think Canadians will take no lessons from a former housing minister who was in a government that didn't believe in investing in housing. Obviously, over decades, Mr. Speaker, the federal government had underinvested in housing, and it has led to the challenges we're facing now. That is why we are putting, and have been putting, in service of Canadians since 2017, the solid fiscal position of the federal government to invest in Canadians, to invest in communities, to invest in housing, to help solve this challenge that people are facing around the world, that we are solving despite.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, he's absolutely right that we did not waste the billions of dollars that he's now put into his programs, but here are the results. The average rent for a one-bedroom when I was housing minister was $973, and we built 80,000 apartment units at that low rate when I was minister. Now the cost has more than doubled. Meanwhile, Stats Canada reports that incomes are down $17,000 per family. Why are Canadians making $17,000 less to pay double the price for a home?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Here's the question Canadians should be asking the Leader of the Opposition. Given that Canada has one of the strongest economic balance sheets in the G7 right now, country for country compared, should we be investing to support Canadians and create housing with that solid balance sheet, or should, as the Conservative Leader is proposing, we cut programs, we reduce investment, and we do less for Canadians? We should be putting the strong fiscal position of this government in service of Canadians. That's what we're doing. That's what he opposes.
Mr. Speaker, the NDP leader was just asking about why the Prime Minister gave tens of millions of dollars in corporate handouts to powerful grocery chains. So the answer, of course, is that he voted to let the Prime Minister do that. Not a single penny of that money could have gone without the vote of the NDP coalition partner. But we learned something else, that this might have been due to the influence of the NDP leader's spokesman and brother, whose company is a lobbyist for Metro. Would the Prime Minister support an investigation into whether or not the NDP leader's spokesman and brother has been unduly influencing the leader of the NDP?
The Right Honourable Prime. The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we can see very clearly that all the stories out about the lobbyists' connections with the Leader of the Opposition are actually hurting the Leader of the Opposition, which is why he's asking those questions of the NDP. But he has an opportunity right now, Mr. Speaker, to make it clear that he stands with Canadians and stands to ask the wealthiest to pay a little more by announcing now that he will support our measure on increasing the capital gains imposition on Canadians, asking the wealthiest to pay a little bit more. He has dodged that question since the budget came out. Does he support the increase on the capital gains inclusion rate?
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, I do support the Prime Minister paying more tax on the trust fund where he sheltered all of his money. Absolutely. He doesn't, unfortunately, support his own policies. That's why he won't put them into a budget bill. But one tax he is increasing is the carbon tax on food. He's doing it with the help of the NDP. We already have the second highest carbon tax in the entire developed world. And yet, if the NDP Liberal government is re-elected, they plan to quadruple that tax to 61 cents a litre on the farmers and truckers who bring us our food. How will Canadians afford to eat, heat, and house themselves?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Once again, Canadians saw that he avoided pronouncing on whether or not he supports our increase to the capital gains inclusions rate. But in regards to his deflection onto carbon pricing works. We are on track to meet our emissions for the first time in any government in Canadian history. And Canadians get more money back in their pockets thanks to the Canada Carbon Rebate. And families are already using that rebate to help pay their bills and plan their monthly budgets. Meanwhile, the Conservative Leader continues to oppose every measure we put forward for both affordability and fighting climate change.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, this Prime Minister, just like his carbon tax, is not worth the cost. The tax is already up to 17 cents a litre, higher than he promised it would go. And he plans to quadruple it further to 61 cents a litre. This after it is a proven environmental failure. Canada ranks 62nd out of 67 countries when it comes to fighting climate change. And this is precisely because what he has is a tax plan and not an environmental plan. Will he stop? Why won't he adopt our common sense plan for technology and not taxes?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, if the Leader of the Opposition wants to present an actual plan to fight climate change, we'd love to see it, but he has refused to take any measure to fight climate change, period. He even doesn't recognize that pollution has a cost, which will only keep rising if we don't fight climate change, with extreme weather events and health impacts increasingly impacting on Canadians. Indeed, the Conservative leader thinks it should be free to pollute, and that we shouldn't be giving more money to Canadians through the Canada carbon rebate. We will continue to have an effective plan to fight climate change that is reducing emissions and putting more money back in Canadians' pockets with the CCR.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, since the Prime Minister introduced his carbon tax on the farmers who grow the food and the truckers who ship the food, it has raised the price on all who buy the food, with a record-smashing 2 million visits to food banks every single year. 50% of Canadians buying food past best before dates. 20% of them have gotten sick as a result of it. The Prime Minister promised that he was going to help the middle class and those working hard to join it. Now, the so-called middle class can't afford food and homes. Is that what he meant by help?
Yeah. The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, according to the Parliamentary Budget Officer, 8 out of 10 Canadians, middle-income and lower-income Canadians primarily, do better with the Canada carbon rebate that lands in their bank accounts 4 times a year because of the price of pollution. But if the leader opposite actually cared about affordability and supporting vulnerable Canadians, he'd be standing up to support our measure on dental care, which has now delivered dental care to 30,000 vulnerable seniors across this country already in just a few weeks. He would be supporting our initiatives to help families. He'd be supporting our initiatives to help with childcare.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Oh, we have to do this all over again with him. The Parliamentary Budget Officer produced a report. I'm going to read the title so that he can Google it right now, Mr. Speaker. It is called the Parliamentary Budget Officer's Report on the Distribution of Costs and Benefits under the Carbon Pricing Program. He can look at page 3. Where every single province that has the tax sees middle-class Canadians and 60% of families paying more in tax than they get back in benefits. Why won't he get to know the facts and axe the tax?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
As opposed to the Leader of the Opposition's campaign to simply axe the facts, we are going to continue to stand with the science, the evidence, the research, the economists who have all pointed out, including the Parliamentary Budget Officer, that the Canada carbon rebate puts more money in the pockets of 8 out of 10 families in the jurisdictions across the country in which it is, and is effective in bringing down our emissions while creating economic growth as we invest in cleaner technology and good jobs and careers for the future. We have a plan for the economy and the environment. He does not.
I'm going to ask members, please. I know sometimes that members don't like hearing the question or the answer, but I'm asking all members, please, the only one who is standing up to, recognized by the Speaker, has the right to stand up and to ask the question. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, with his comedy routine, I was going to say that he shouldn't quit his day job, but actually, he should quit his day job. But he shouldn't go into number crunching, whatever his next job is, because he doesn't believe the economy is about numbers. And I don't blame him, because if I had his economic record, I wouldn't want to talk about numbers either. But it might help him to go to the library and quietly study just a little bit. Will he commit to reading page 3 of the Parliamentary Budget Officer's report, which demonstrates Canadians pay more than they get back in the tax?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the Parliamentary Budget Officer and far many more experts and economists have clearly demonstrated that the money that returns to Canadians through the Canada Carbon Rebate 4 times a year is greater than 8 out of 10 Canadians pay every year with the price on pollution. Those are the simple facts, Mr. Speaker. We will continue to invest in Canadians. We will continue to support with affordability. We will continue to put the best balance sheet in the G7 in the service of Canadians through investments and support, unlike the cuts he's proposing.
Hear, hear.
Leader of the Opposition. After 9 years, this Prime Minister is not worth the cost of housing. He has doubled the cost of housing. And now the crisis is such that more people than ever in Quebec are struggling. Not-for-profit organizations are saying that some people are even contemplating suicide because they can't afford their rent next month. Will the Prime Minister finally stop his radical plan of building more bureaucracy instead of more housing? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, we invested $900 million in Quebec alone with the Housing Accelerator Fund, and it's so well received by Quebecers that the government of Quebec has decided to match that with $900 million of their own, because they know that that will deliver housing all across Quebec. We stand for working together with the provinces and municipalities to invest more in housing, while meantime the Conservative leader is advocating ideological policies and austerity. What they're saying is false, the Honourable Leader of the Opposition. And now he's spending more for fewer houses. It's true that he's spending hundreds of millions, billions, tens of billions. Every year it's a new number, more money for this program or that program. But people don't live by those numbers. They don't live in those numbers. They live in apartments and houses that cost twice as much as they did when he first took office. So does he now get it? After 9 years of creating the worst real estate crisis in the G7, does he not realize that the more he spends, the more expensive things get? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, people know full well that our investments in housing take years for the effects to be felt. And while he was housing minister under the previous government, they spent virtually nothing on housing for 10 years. They made no investments in housing. And now we're supposed to be surprised that in 2015, 2016, 2017, we started to see a housing crisis. It's because they underinvested for too long in housing. We are there to invest in communities and help Canadians out. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition. Mr. Speaker, I celebrated the fact, not admitted the fact, I celebrated the fact that our programs were much less costly and accomplished much more. The average rent was $973 a month, and now it's almost $2,000 a month. It used to take 38% on average for monthly bills, and now it's up to almost 64% of a person's income goes to paying the bills. Will he not admit that it's not just because the programs are expensive doesn't mean they're good? The Honourable Prime Minister. Well, we can see the fundamental choice Canadians will face in the next election. Should the government use Canada's strong fiscal position, the strongest among our allies, should that be put to the service of Canadians to invest in our communities and in housing, or should we cut programs, cut back to make our fiscal position even stronger, even though it's already the strongest in the G7? He's advocating ideological cuts and austerity instead of helping Canadians with what they need. Let's let Canadians make the choice. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition. Mr. Speaker, ever since he started his big spending programs, interest rates have increased. When you double the national debt, that drives interest rates up. Imagine. And everybody can see that that's the result. And that's why Canada has the highest mortgage debt and the highest housing costs in the G7. Will he not follow my common sense plan, dollar for dollar spending and reduction to reduce inflation rates? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, because of our sound fiscal management, inflation is coming down into the target range set by the Bank of Canada, and interest rates will also start coming down in the months to come. We're almost sure of that. And the Leader of the Opposition is mixing two things up: our very strong fiscal position and the situation of Canadian families who need more help. I am proposing that we use our strong position to help Canadians, but according to him, the government should cut back on services to Canadians, and he is wrong.
After 9 years, this Prime Minister is not worth the cost. Drugs, crime, and disorder are rampant, and they offer care to children, and some people have to think about moving because a man died of an overdose in front of an early childhood care center. Will the Prime Minister listen to the Mayor of Montreal, who wants to legalize hard drugs, as he did in British Columbia? Is that what he's going to do? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, it's shameful to see the Leader of the Opposition instrumentalize tragedy to fearmonger and to raise funds for his party. Mr. Speaker, the reality is that they're wrong about the facts. There is no one in this country, beside the Leader of the Opposition, who is talking about legalizing hard drugs. Our approach is based on science, compassion, and a public health approach. That is what people need. They need housing and services and assistance, and that's what we're delivering. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
His government that's talking about legalizing drugs. They did it already. They legalized hard drugs in British Columbia, and the NDP in that province pulled back just before their election. Now, the Prime Minister has in his possession an application from the City of Toronto to repeat the same nightmare in that city. The minister responsible says that application is, quote, dormant, not dead, dormant. Dormant means asleep. Isn't that really the Prime Minister's plan, to wake it up after the election so that he can impose the same thing on Toronto he did in BC?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, it's shameful to see the Leader of the Opposition misleading this House, misleading Canadians for his own fundraising political gain. There is nobody in this country talking about legalizing hard drugs, with the possible exception of members of the Conservative Party themselves. Mr. Speaker, our approach is focused on a public health approach grounded in science, compassion, and community safety. We're talking about the wraparound services like housing, mental health treatment, harm reduction that is helping people around the country, and we will continue to work with provinces and jurisdictions in their approach.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
The Prime Minister is playing word games again. He pretends that there's a difference between legalization and decriminalization. Basically the same thing, but we'll use his word. He brought in decriminalization in British Columbia, which led to a 380% increase in overdose deaths, 2,500 deaths last year, the worst death count in any province's history. So will he A, admit that his decriminalization in BC was a deadly disaster, or B, admit that he plans to do it again right across the country, everywhere after the next election?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, earlier the Leader of the Opposition was suggesting I did my homework. You'd think that on an issue that the Leader of the Opposition is making so much fundraising money off of, he would have actually done his work and realized there is a difference between legalization and decriminalization, and that's one that really matters. We, yes, responded to a request for a pilot project by British Columbia to continue to try and approach new approaches in solving this toxic drug overdose epidemic, and we will continue to work with British Columbia as we have, as they choose to make adjustments to their pilot project, because we know saving lives and keeping communities safe is the most important thing.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, I just asked now 4 times whether he plans to replicate in Montreal, in Toronto, or anywhere else the radical experiment that he's had to backpedal on in British Columbia. He won't answer the question. He has a request from the Montreal Mayor, the Toronto City Hall, and we don't know what other municipalities. So either A, he believes the experiment was a disaster, or B, he plans to repeat it. Which is it?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I have answered this question many times by saying that the only way we move forward on any proposals across this country around decriminalization or other methods to support to fight the toxic drug overdose is when provinces step up and actually ask for it. Failing that, we will not be moving forward on any modifications. However, there are provinces that are choosing to reduce their harm reduction measures, and we will continue to increase harm reduction and public health responses to overdoses and safe supply issues right across the country.
Not only is the Prime Minister refusing to rule out future decriminalization across the country that has just failed in BC, he's now just announced he plans to spend even more tax dollars on narcotic opioids. According to the Vancouver Chief of Police, 50% of the recovered hydromorphone was originated with government programs handing it out as so-called safe supply. This program has led to a 166% increase in drug deaths across the country since it was brought in. Why won't he accept my common sense plan to stop giving out deadly drugs and start giving out treatment?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition proposes to return to the failed Harper-era approaches on opioids that their own former advisor, Benjamin Perrin, called obsolete and immoral. Mr. Speaker, over the past number of years, we've invested in a compassionate, science-based, evidence-grounded approach that includes harm reduction, that includes approaching with a public health lens on this. It also includes investing in housing, in mental health supports, in frontline workers, in addiction treatment and recovery programs. These are the things that move us forward, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, when we were in government, there were 60% fewer overdose deaths. This problem accelerated after he brought in these radical programs that are not done anywhere else to give corrupt pharmaceutical companies money to hand out more drugs. David McAvoy, an addiction outreach worker right here in Ottawa, says that he witnesses the so-called safe supply clients diverting their taxpayer-funded drugs to the black market, and that they are given, quote, an insane quantity of drugs. Will the Prime Minister stop giving out insane quantities of heroin-grade opioids and start bringing treatment so we can bring our loved ones home drug-free?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I don't know that any Canadian would think that adding more ideology to our approach to public health, dealing with the opioids epidemic is a solution, and yet that's the only thing that the Conservative Party seems to offer. We will continue to be grounded in a compassionate, science-based approach that works with local partners, that attempts to provide the kinds of wraparound services, whether it's housing, whether it's healthcare, whether it's addiction treatment and recovery, whether it's culturally appropriate services for those who need it. We will continue to be there to help heal people, not imprison them.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
They are there to help kill people right now. That's exactly what they're doing. And, Mr. Speaker,
I'm going to, colleagues, I'll be coming, colleagues. We are going to, the Speaker will come back to this issue. I'll allow the Honourable Member to continue his question. It's 24 seconds on the clock.
not only is his policy killing people, but this Prime Minister is by far the most radical ideologue who's ever occupied that job. Yes. But always with these radical policies comes profiteering. The companies that are making the money off of the opioids that are funded by Canadian taxpayers, and it is indeed sick, Mr. Speaker. Will the Prime Minister agree to release all of the contracts for those pharmaceutical companies?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we are facing right across the country a toxic drug and opioid epidemic that is taking lives left, right, and center, that is hurting communities, that is hurting family members who are losing loved ones at an alarming rate that is something we need to respond to. And we have continued to work jurisdiction by jurisdiction in thoughtful ways to try and do everything possible to both keep communities safe and to keep families from suffering these further losses and support people struggling with addiction. We will continue to be grounded in evidence and support.
Right on. Leader of the Opposition.
After 9 years, this Prime Minister is not worth the corporate crime and corruption. According to the Criminal Intelligence Service, there is $113 billion a year of money laundering. That's the equivalent of twice the entire GDP of Nova Scotia. And that money laundering, all of it here in Canada, drives up housing costs, it pays for drugs and stolen cars. Why is it that the Americans had to be the ones to catch TD and charge them with money laundering linked to fentanyl? Why didn't our federal government crack down on that?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, this is obviously a very concerning situation. We're making sure that all the appropriate authorities are properly engaged. We know that we need to continue to invest in our national policing. We need to continue to invest in our intelligence services, and that's exactly what this government has been doing and will continue to do. Unlike the previous Conservative government that cut policing, that cut intelligence services, we will continue to be investing in keeping Canadians safe, in countering the rise of organized crime, and in making sure that people are confident about the future we're growing into.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Speaker, the Liberal member for Glengarry Prescott Russell used crass language to Quebec witnesses who had come to defend the French language. This is not just a Liberal member. He is also the chair of the Parliamentary Association of the Francophonie, in fact, a diplomat representing Canada. He has only one single choice, and that is to resign. Will the Prime Minister call for the resignation of this member to show respect for La Francophonie? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, we can see the reaction of the Francophone members in the Conservative Party when the leader finally is showing concern about French in Canada. We are here to defend la francophonie. We are here to defend the French fact across Canada. And the member apologized. He withdrew his remarks. But we're also seeing is that their own heritage critic was unable to defend Radio-Canada when a direct question was put. We know that the Conservatives want to cut CBC funding, and they should say so clearly. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition. Mr. Speaker, he's the one who's cutting funding to Radio-Canada CBC, and we are the ones who are going to protect Radio-Canada at CBC, and we're going to conserve jobs at CBC. Mr. Speaker, why does this Prime Minister continue to defend gigantic bonuses for CBC bureaucrats? Because Canadians want nothing to do with this. Why don't they protect Radio-Canada services instead of bonuses? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, there is no one who speaks French in this country who thinks that the Conservatives are going to defend Radio-Canada. That's a joke. They know full well that the ideological opposition of the Conservative Party to public broadcasters is deeply rooted, and they know full well that the cuts to CBC Radio-Canada are going to come if a Conservative government is elected. And that's why they know that they have to fight the Conservative ideology. But I urge the Conservative leader to say in English what he has just said in French.